The beach stretched out before me, an endless expanse of soft, golden sand meeting the gentle roll of waves. The sun hung low in the sky, casting everything in shades of amber and pink. It was my favorite time of day, when the world seemed to slow down and the beach transformed into a sanctuary of solitude. I had come here often since moving to this small coastal town, a place to escape, to think, to lose myself in the rhythm of the waves. Today was no different, or so I thought, until I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me, breaking the quiet hum of the evening. Turning, I saw him, Mr. Holden, my neighbor. His silhouette was framed by the golden light, his weathered face softened by the glow. At 65, he had a calm, composed demeanor that I had always admired. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention, but there was something about his presence that commanded respect. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, his voice deep but gentle, carrying easily over the sound of the waves. "I didn't realize anyone else would be here." "It's fine," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I come here to get away." "Guess you do too." He smiled faintly, stepping closer until he stood a few feet away. It's hard to resist a place like this. There was an ease to the way he spoke, as if he belonged here more than anyone. I watched as he glanced around, his gaze lingering on the horizon before settling on me. "What brings you out here today?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. "Ooh," I shrugged, unsure of how to explain the pull this place had on me. Just needed to clear my head, I guess." He nodded, as if he understood completely. Sometimes the sea has a way of putting things into perspective. We stood there in comfortable silence, the sound of the waves filling the space between us. I found myself stealing glances at him, noticing the way the light caught the lines on his face, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. It was strange. I had known Mr. Holden for years, but this was the first time I truly saw him. "Do you come here often?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Not as much as I'd like," he admitted. "Life has a way of keeping you busy, even when you think you've earned some peace." His words struck a chord, and I nodded. "I get that." He smiled then, a soft, fleeting expression that felt almost private. "You're young. You've got time to figure it all out." The comment was meant to be reassuring, but there was something in his tone, a hint of wistfulness, perhaps, that made my chest tighten. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat as his gaze lingered on me, unspoken questions flickering in his eyes. Before I could say anything, he gestured toward the sand. "Mind if I sit?" "Of course," I said quickly, shifting to make room as he lowered himself onto the sand beside me. The proximity felt both natural and charged, the space between us filled with a tension I couldn't quite name. For a while we sat in silence, watching the waves as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. There was a stillness to the moment that felt almost sacred, as if the beach itself was holding its breath. "You're awfully quiet," he said eventually, his voice light but probing. "Not like you." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Just thinking, I guess." He glanced at me then, his expression thoughtful. "About what?" The question hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I looked away, focusing on the way the waves lapped at the shore. "About everything," I said finally. "And nothing," Mr. Holden chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "Sounds about right." His laughter eased some of the tension, and I found myself smiling despite the strange flutter in my chest. There was something about him, something I couldn't quite put into words that made me want to stay, to keep talking, to understand the quiet mystery of the man who had always been just out of reach. The golden light of the setting sun stretched its fingers across the sand, casting long shadows and painting the beach in warm hues. The tide ebbed and flowed with a steady rhythm, the waves lapping at the shore like a heartbeat. Mr. Holden sat beside me, his presence both grounding and disarming. The lines on his face, softened by the evening light, seemed to hold 1,000 stories, and for the first time, I found myself wondering about the man who had lived just a few doors away for so many years. He cleared his throat, breaking the quiet that had settled over us. "It's funny," he said, his voice low and contemplative, "how we can live next to someone for so long and still know so little about them." The comment struck me, partly because it mirrored my own thoughts. "I was just thinking the same thing," I admitted, glancing over at him. His smile was faint, almost wistful. "I suppose we're all guilty of it, keeping to ourselves, assuming there'll always be time to connect later." There was a heaviness in his tone that I couldn't ignore. I wanted to ask what he meant, but I hesitated, unsure if I had the right to pry. Instead, I said, "Well, we're here now. It's not too late." He turned his head to look at me, his gaze steady and searching. "No," he said softly, "it's not." The moment hung between us, delicate and charged, before he turned back to the horizon. The sun had dipped lower, its light casting a golden path across the water. The air felt cooler now, the faintest breeze carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. I wrapped my arms around my knees, leaning forward as I tried to swirl through the jumble of thoughts swirling in my head. "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for something?" I asked suddenly, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Mr. Holden looked at me, his expression thoughtful. "Waiting for what?" I shrugged, unsure how to articulate what I meant. I don't know, just something more. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "I think everyone feels that way at some point," he said finally. "But the trick is figuring out if you're waiting for something to happen or if you're waiting for yourself to make it happen." His words hit me like a wave, knocking the breath out of me. I looked at him, startled by the insight in his gaze. "And what about you?" I asked. "Are you waiting for something?" His lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe I was," he said, his voice quiet. "But now I think I'm just trying to appreciate what's in front of me." The way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on mine, made my pulse quicken. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks, and I quickly looked away, focusing on the waves instead. The silence between us grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us seemed willing to break. I didn't mean to make things heavy," he said after a moment, his tone lighter. "You have enough on your mind." "It's okay," I said quickly. "I like talking about these things." He smiled, a real one this time, and the sight of it made my chest tighten. "You're different," he said, his voice warm with something that felt like admiration. "Most people don't want to think too much about, well, anything." I laughed softly, the sound a little shaky. "Maybe I think too much." "There's nothing wrong with that," he said. "It just means you see the world differently." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. Instead, I let the moment settle, the quiet between us filling with the sound of the waves and the faint cry of seagulls in the distance. The sun dipped lower, its light fading into shades of amber and rose, and the beach seemed to grow smaller, more intimate. As the shadows lengthened, Mr. Holden shifted beside me, his movements slow and deliberate. "Do you ever feel like some moments are different?" he asked, his voice low. "Like they mean more than the ones that came before?" I turned to him, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Like the universe is trying to tell you something," he said finally, "that you're standing on the edge of something important." His gaze held mine, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. There was something in his eyes, something raw and unguarded, that made my chest ache. I wanted to look away, to break the intensity of the moment, but I couldn't. I was trapped, caught in the pull of his presence, the weight of his words. "I think I know what you mean," I said softly, my voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. His expression softened, and he nodded, as if I'd just confirmed something he'd been wondering about. "I thought you might." The air between us felt heavy, charged with an energy that I couldn't quite name. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man beneath the calm, composed exterior. The man who had lived a life full of experiences I could only imagine, who carried the weight of those experiences with quiet grace. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you," I said, the words slipping out before I could think better of them. He blinked, startled, before a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, that's quite the compliment." "It's the truth," I said, my voice steady despite the rapid beat of my heart. His smile widened, and he leaned back on his hands, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I could say the same about you." The words hung in the air between us, filling the space with a warmth that was both comforting and disarming. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent, letting the moment speak for itself. The sun slipped below the horizon, its light fading into a deep, dusky blue, and the first stars began to appear in the sky. "It's getting late," Mr. Holden said eventually, his voice soft. I nodded, reluctant to break the spell of the evening. "Yeah." He stood, brushing the sand from his hands, and offered me a hand to help me up. I hesitated for a moment before taking it, his grip warm and steady. When I was on my feet, he didn't let go right away, his fingers lingering against mine as his gaze held mine. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For tonight." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "Thank you." For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us heavy, with everything we weren't saying. And then, slowly, he let go of my hand, his fingers trailing against mine before falling away. As he walked back toward the path that led to the houses, I stayed where I was, watching him go, my chest tight with emotions I didn't fully understand. The stars above seemed brighter now, their light reflected in the still surface of the ocean, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just crossed a line I hadn't even known was there. I stood there for a long time after Mr. Holden disappeared down the winding path, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows of the dunes. The night was quieter now, the rhythmic crash of the waves the only sound breaking the stillness. My skin felt warm where his hand had lingered, the memory of his touch seared into me like the fading glow of the sunset. Something about the evening felt irrevocable, as though a door had been opened that neither of us could close. The beach, now bathed in the cool silver light of the moon, felt different, more intimate, as if it had witnessed something it wasn't supposed to. I couldn't shake the weight of his words, the look in his eyes that had seemed to pierce right through me. There had always been something enigmatic about Mr. Holden, a quiet intensity that I'd chalked up to his age, his experiences. But tonight, I'd seen more than that. I'd seen a man unguarded, his defenses lowered, in a way that mirrored my own. I started gathering my things, trying to focus on the mundane task to calm the swirling thoughts in my head. The tide had come in slightly, lapping at the edge of my towel. I wrung out the fabric as best I could, draping it over my arm before slinging my bag over my shoulder. Yet, as much as I tried to ground myself in the motions, my mind kept circling back to him, to the way he'd looked at me, the things he'd said. The path back to the houses was dark and winding, the sand cooling beneath my feet as I trudged up the incline. My heart was racing, though I couldn't say why. The evening felt unfinished, like a song cut off before its final note. I found myself glancing back at the beach, its endless expanse, now shrouded in shadow, and I wondered if Mr. Holden was feeling the same restless energy that had settled in my chest. When I reached the top of the dune, the glow of the houses came into view, their windows lit like beacons against the dark. His house was the closest to the beach, a modest, weathered structure with a wrap-around porch that always seemed inviting, even in its simplicity. As I passed it, my steps slowed. The porch light was on, casting a warm halo over the steps, and through the open curtains, I could see it was empty. I have since seen that the curtains have perfectly more balance than the water, again. As his nature, the windows given the sentiment. Seemingly intentionally, he had a glass in his hand, the amber liquid catching the light as he turned it slowly, staring down into it as if it held the answers to whatever questions were running through his mind. I paused, torn between the urge to keep walking and the pull to stop, to linger, to do something. My hand tightened on the strap of my bag, and before I could overthink it, my feet carried me forward up the porch steps. I knocked softly on the doorframe, my heart hammering in my chest. He looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment before a flicker of surprise crossed his face. Then he smiled, small, almost hidden, and gestured for me to come in. "I didn't think I'd see you again tonight," he said as I stepped inside, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. I shrugged, setting my bag down near the door. "Neither did I." The room felt warmer than the night air outside. The scent of aged wood and faintly salty air wrapping around me like a blanket. He motioned toward the other chair at the table, and I sat down, my hands resting in my lap as I tried to ignore the way they trembled. For a moment we didn't speak. He sipped from his glass, his gaze thoughtful as he studied me. I felt exposed under his scrutiny, but there was no malice in it, just curiosity, and perhaps a hint of something deeper. "You seemed lost in thought back there," he said finally, breaking the silence. I nodded, unsure how much I should say. I guess I was. He tilted his head, his expression softening. "Want to talk about it?" I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. There was so much I could say, so much I wanted to say, but the weight of it all felt overwhelming. Instead, I shook my head. "I don't know where to start." His smile was gentle, understanding. "Sometimes it's not about where you start. It's about what you're willing to say." His words settled over me, warm and steady, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Ah, you make it sound so simple." "It can be," he said, his voice quiet, "if you let it." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and the openness in his eyes nearly undid me. He wasn't just my neighbor anymore. He was something more. Something I didn't have a name for, but couldn't deny. The air between us felt charged, the silence heavy with everything we weren't saying. "I've always admired you," I said softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His expression shifted, a flicker of surprise, followed by something warmer, deeper. "Admired me?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. You have this way of seeing the world, of being in it. It's like you're always present, always grounded. I've never met anyone like that before. His gaze held mine, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Something raw, unguarded, and impossibly real. "You're more observant than most," he said, his voice low, "and far more insightful than you give yourself credit for." I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, and I looked away, unsure how to respond. The tension between us was almost unbearable now, a thread pulled taut, ready to snap. I could feel his gaze on me, the weight of it pressing against my skin. And when I finally dared to meet his eyes again, the intensity there left me breathless. "Tell me if I'm wrong," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't think I am. My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the table as if it could anchor me. "You're not." The words were barely out of my mouth before he stood, his movements slow and deliberate as he stepped around the table. He stopped in front of me, his hand reaching out to brush against mine, his touch warm and steady. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet urgency. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back." I looked up at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "I've never been more sure." His hand lingered on mine, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver through me that I couldn't suppress. The weight of his question hung in the air between us, as tangible as the tension that had been building since the beach. His eyes searched mine, their intensity softening into something more vulnerable, more open. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. He exhaled softly, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "I never expected this," he murmured, his voice low and raw. "But I can't ignore it anymore." His words mirrored my own thoughts, the ones I'd been too afraid to acknowledge until now. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse quicken as I stood to meet him, the small distance between us disappearing in an instant. He didn't move at first, his gaze locked on mine, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Then, slowly, his hand rose to cup my face, his touch gentle but deliberate. His thumb brushed against my cheek, a feather-light caress that sent warmth coursing through me. "You're sure?" he asked again, his voice trembling just slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening. "I'm sure," I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. That was all the reassurance he needed. His hand slid to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair as he leaned in, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was both hesitant and electric. It was as if every moment of tension, every unspoken thought had finally found release, and I felt myself melting into him, my hands gripping his shoulders as if to anchor myself. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, each movement filled with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. His other hand found my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt the heat of his body against mine, grounding me even as my thoughts spiraled. The air around us seemed to hum with energy, every sound, every sensation amplified. When we finally broke apart, his forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the stillness of the room. His eyes searched mine, and I saw something there that made my chest ache, something vulnerable, yet unshakable. "This changes everything," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," I replied, my hands still clutching his shirt as if letting go wasn't an option. "But I don't want to go back." His lips curved into a faint smile, and he kissed me again, slower this time, as if savoring every second. His hands moved to my back, his touch firm yet gentle, and I felt myself leaning into him, my body responding to his in a way that felt both inevitable and profound. The room seemed smaller now, the space between us non-existent, as he guided me toward the small sofa by the window. The moonlight streamed in, casting a soft glow over the room. And I couldn't help but think how surreal it all felt, how right it felt. He sat down, pulling me with him, and I found myself straddling his lap, my hands on his shoulders as his arms wrapped around me. His gaze never left mine, and the intensity of it made my breath hitch. "You're incredible," he said softly, his voice filled with awe. "You have no idea how much I've admired you." The words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I think I've always known," I admitted, my voice trembling, but I was too afraid to believe it. He reached up, his fingers brushing away a stray tear that had escaped down my cheek. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. I leaned in, my lips finding his again, and this time the kiss was filled with a quiet urgency, a need to bridge the gap that had always been between us. His hand slid up my back, pulling me closer, and I felt the world around us blur into insignificance. It was just him, his touch, his warmth, his presence, and for the first time, I felt like I could truly let go. The moments that followed were a blur of sensation and emotion, every touch, every kiss, deepening the connection between us. He was gentle but firm, his movements deliberate, as if he were savoring every second, and I found myself doing the same, losing myself in the way he made me feel, seen, understood, cherished. When we finally pulled back, both of us breathless, he cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing against my cheeks. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "More than okay," I said softly, my lips curving into a faint smile. His own smile widened, and he pressed a lingering kiss to my forehead. "Good." We sat there for a while, wrapped in each other's arms, the silence between us filled with unspoken promises. The weight of what had just happened settled over me, but it wasn't heavy. It was comforting, grounding. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. "I've spent so long keeping my distance," he said after a while, his voice quiet, convincing myself it was the right thing to do. But tonight, he trailed off, his gaze meeting mine. "Tonight, I couldn't anymore." "I'm glad you didn't," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "because I couldn't either." His arms tightened around me, pulling me closer, and I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The moonlight bathed the room in a soft glow, and as I closed my eyes, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever questions or doubts might arise, I knew one thing for certain. This was real, and it was worth it.